Hello, good afternoon. I'm Francesca Hughes and I'm speaking from the Balaga where we're running a masterclass on Alive and Kicking the Body Quick. This is our third lecture, as various lectures we've invited into the masterclass. It's going to be given by Endriana Audisho. It's a great pleasure, Endriana, to welcome you here and to have your intervention. Endriana Audisho is a lecturer at UTS. She's about to finish her PhD, which will no doubt imminently be an amazing book entitled Screening Architecture. It looks at the connascency of architecture's relationship to the digital screen in the 90s with the use of the screen, i.e. the televised screen, in the conflicts of the 90s, mostly in the Middle East, and looking at that kind of extraordinary feedback going on between the two new aesthetics. Her pedagogical project that is been the focus of her other research at UTS looks at dismantling the colonial gaze and devising what she calls the counter-surveilled body. In a sense, looks at the relationship, the kind of ongoing relationship between surveillance systems and colonization. So in a sense, is working on decolonizing through rethinking surveillance. Endriana, it's a great pleasure to have you join us. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca, for the warm introduction and invitation to lecture on the counter-surveilled body. I've been watching from afar, and although I would have really enjoyed being there in person, it is only fitting that I speak through the very device that encompasses and constructs many of the spatial and material effects of surveillance, that of the digital screen. If the pandemic has afforded us anything, it is this heightened collapse of space and time through the screen, for me to be here and there at the same time. Before I speak through and delve into discourse on surveillance and the screen, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I'd also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I'd like to further acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which you all join us today, and to pay respects to those elders past and present. As briefly mentioned by Francesca, I'm a lecturer and PhD candidate in the School of Architecture at UTS. My practice, that is my research and pedagogy, sits between the broader fields of architecture, media studies, and cultural studies, and is primarily concerned with the politics of representation. I see my practice as a forum, platform, and testing ground to expose forms of control, specifically colonial legacies implicit in contemporary cities, and in turn explore what an architecture that uses tactics to undo the visual strategies set up by hegemonic systems would look like. That is, to use strategies of the counter-visual and counter-surveyed body. Much of this thinking can be owed to a number of key figures, including American writer, feminist, and civil rights activist Audre Lorde, who dedicated her life and body of work to confront injustices of all kinds, racism, classism, sexism, to name a few. She famously self-described herself as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, and she is all of those things and more. I'd like to particularly draw your attention to this book published in 1984, where she writes, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they never will enable us to bring about genuine change." To put simply, and in doing so, I'm probably not giving enough acclaim to the work, we simply cannot undo systems of oppression using the logic that justifies that very same oppression. Lorde's provocation is a revolutionary tool and really a terrifying force for anyone that stands in its way, because the beauty of it is that it can be applied to absolutely anything and everything, from language to architecture to art. As I join today from one institution and speak to another, it's only fair to acknowledge the complicitness of the power structures inherent in these spaces. But before I allow myself and you to be derailed from the hope that genuine change is possible, it is important to note that to undo also means to redo, reimagine, and redesign. A decolonial way of practicing is therefore about simultaneously undoing and redoing. And what a rich body of work there is out there for us to engage with and situate this kind of feminist and decolonial desires. From Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto to Bell Hook's Feminism for Everyone, to more recently Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life. There is a clear thread through this body of work, and that is the welcoming of the other or the other bodies. The post-colonial, decolonised, the LGBTQ+, Indigenous, immigrant, refugee, non-binary, non-human, to name a few. My practice leans on and works through these references, as I'm by no means an expert in this field or area, but nonetheless am starting to develop a body of work that flirts with this idea of the politics of representation in architecture. I'm translating these ideas predominantly through my pedagogy, as Francesca briefly mentioned. Since 2019, I've led a research and design studio in the Masters of Architecture here at UTS entitled Dossier Cities Under Surveillance. The premise to date has been to use decolonial practices and methodologies to first reveal systems of control and in turn propose alternative narratives, fictions, and imaginaries of the city. In the latest iteration of the studio, which I'm currently teaching right now, we've turned to a typology that epitomizes colonial practices, the archive. Alongside its sister typologies of the museum and the library, the archive is understood as a site that perpetuates injustice and exclusion through the colonial practices of classification, display, and ownership. By exploring archival absences, the studio looks to the design of a counter-archive. And I'll be presenting studio work in the latter half of the lecture. I'm also questioning representations of architecture in the city through my PhD entitled Screening Architecture, Architecture, Media and Conflict since the 1990s. Architecture has recently begun to investigate its relationship to digital media, specifically the effects of digital design on techniques of architectural production and representation. To date, this discussion has focused on the algorithmic encoding of architectural form. However, the interface by which the digital manifests and through which it is engaged, the screen, has received little attention. This thesis argues that a focus on the screen and specifically cathode ray tube, so CRT technology that underpins both TV and computer screens since the 1990s, allows a different history of the digital in architecture and of contemporary architecture itself. One that is enmeshed within a broader media theory of the screen and the way it organizes relationship between aesthetic practices and geopolitical concerns. I unfortunately don't have the luxury of time to unpack the nuances within the dissertation in the lecture today. However, I'll attempt to present a brief summary because it really does influence the work on the screen and surveillance, obviously. The thesis claims that the coalescence of live phosphor-green images of Baghdad unfolding on CRT screens during the Gulf War, 1991, and the resurgence of media theory through the critical commentary on technology's impact on the organisation of territory and perception of reality, predominantly through the theoretical writings of Paul Virilio and Jean Baudrillard, intersected with the arrival of CRT screens in architectural studio, and created a context in which the screen's material presence and mediating effects became of architectural concern. Here you can see the introduction of the computer in the paperless studio in 1994. This was also being something that was explored in the work of small critically engaged practices, such as the early installation work of Dilla Scofidio, who were operating, I'm claiming, and is evidenced by looking at the material kind of that period. They were operating at a moment where really interesting discourse on the intersection between sexuality, gender, the body, and space were emerging. So you can see here sexuality in space and fetish both coming out of Princeton during the late 80s, early 90s. However, by the end of the decade, screen-based architecture and the screen's live transmission of conflicts, the thesis argues, literally collapse in the architectural and political attempts to deal with the event of 9/11. The thesis discusses how the digital aesthetics of the smooth photo-rendered image of the 2002 proposals to design a new World Trade Center, enabled by LCD and plasma screen technology, became intertwined with the politics of the war on terror, the ongoing international military campaign launched by the US government following the September 11 attacks. This case study illustrates how, at the turn of the 21st century, the theoretical explorations prompted by the paperless studio and by the critically engaged screen practices was subsumed by post-criticality and a techno-formal aesthetic, as seen here by the self-declared digital avant-garde collaborative United Architects competition proposal. The computer was now purely used as a tool for production and representation, as opposed to thinking, which we saw in the early 90s. Although a critical engagement with the screen was taken over by post-criticality and the pro-practice stance by the end of the decade, the postscript of the thesis argues that the emergence of a parallel field of inquiry, dubbed as the material turn, and translated architecturally through the work of forensic architecture, counters the digital design techniques that once were limited to the techno-formal discourse, and instead revives the screen as a cultural product by using architectural and media techniques, as well as investigative journalism, to respond to the new aesthetic and geopolitical concerns that emerged in the late 2000s. And I'm mainly here concerned with looking at the rise of urban conflicts and social media. I guess this was a long preamble to say that both my research and pedagogy are very much interested in the complex mediation between bodies, media, and technology, and aims to explore our contemporary relation to the screen, even its dissonance. The question of surveillance becomes very interesting in this context, as we spend more and more of our time in front of, staring within or on our screens. What is being captured within the crop of the screen and why are very important questions to be asking, specifically in relation to ethics. We often first associate surveillance with CCTV cameras scattered around public spaces. However, the term has a longer history, one that has been discussed before the emergence of ubiquitous electronic and increasingly private eyes. The term surveillance can be deconstructed in its etymological parts, sur, from above, and valence, to watch. Historically, and as Professor of Political Science, Michael Shapiro suggests, the forms of surveillance attending episodes of militarization, violence, and internal surveillance are part of a more general biopolitics. They are articulated with other political functions aimed at accepting, rejecting, or managing bodies. Biopolitics, which is heavily discussed in critical political analyses, originates with, I'm sure, as you all know, Michel Foucault's discussion of the biopolitics of the population, an exercise of governance that brought life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations in the 19th century. Shapiro continues to state that whereas previously states contained a people who were subject to the sovereign's prerogative, by the mid-19th century, governance involved more than merely extracting obedience from its subjects. It became involved in managing a population or bodies. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault uses Bentham's panoptic prison design as architectural translations and as an architectural translation and metaphor for surveillance. The prison panopticon depicts, as you can see in the drawing here, a prison designed as a circular building with an inspector in the central tower who oversees the activities of convicts in their cells. Surveillance is carried out in this model from a single central point, and the guard is depicted as all-seeing and omnipotent, seeing everything, everyone, all the time. Although laying the foundations for the field of surveillance studies, there's been a recent departure from this discourse on the panopticon and the emergence of post-panoptic theories, which I think you all know coincides with the emergence of neoliberalism. For example, moving beyond disciplinary control, Deleuze's control societies is linked to bureaucracy and the dawn of computerized networked surveillance. In postscripts on the societies of control, he states, control is not discipline. You do not confine people with a highway, but by making highways, you multiply the means of control. People can travel infinitely and freely without being confined, while being perfectly controlled. The control of space, people, and things has increased in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. Being the first symbolic event on a world scale and dubbed by Baudrillard as an image event, the proliferation of images circulating in the media absorbed the event, transforming it into a spectacle and offering it for consumption. The prolific visual presence marked an age of imbalance, a shock to the system that destabilized the known physical and psychological landscape of the public on a global scale. In the administration of fear, Virilio highlights that fear is now an environment, a surrounding, a world. It occupies and preoccupies us. This preoccupation with fear and its management has led to the hyper-securitization and surveillance of public space, exacerbated and I would claim legitimized by the declaration of a war on terror post 9/11. The rhetoric associated with ensuring public safety promises predictability and certainty through its systems of data collection and measuring of people and space. This commodification of human behavior in space. Oh, sorry. It's 9 p.m. here and the lights go off every 15 minutes. The commodification of human behavior in space, coined by social psychologist Shoshana Zuboff as surveillance capitalism, claims human experience as a free raw material for translation into behavioral data, transforming the body into a set of coordinates in time and space, an objectifiable and measurable it. This tracking marketed as a perceived benefit for the public, in fact, advantages surveillance capitalists who use the data for the purpose of modification, prediction, monetization, and control. Systems of control are everywhere and nowhere, assumed ubiquitous or alternatively assumed absent, which makes their effects less visible, but paradoxically more potent in the context of the rise of big data. But I question what bodies are being surveyed. When I think about this, I immediately turn to a quote from visual culture, a cultural theorist, Nicholas Mirzoeff's book, The Right to Look. Move on, there's nothing to see here. Only there is. We know it, and so do they. And I think it's clear from my introduction to the lecture that I'm referring to the colonized and in some ways gendered body. Questions of race, class, and gender are deeply entangled in the historical formation of surveillance. From colonial times to now, surveillance technologies have been used to separate the citizen from the slave, to protect the citizen from the slave. Rights media activist Malkia Cyril. One only has to refer to the great escape from slavery of Ellen and William Craft. Born and enslaved in Georgia, Ellen and William escaped north in 1848. Ellen crossed the boundaries of race, class, and gender by passing as a white male planter, with William posing as her personal servant. So you can see the kind of before and after in the bottom images there. Although dubbed as one of the most ingenious escapes in history, this story highlights that techniques of classification, separation, and aestheticization, what Mirzoeff calls a complex of visuality, are deeply ingrained with questions of ethics and politics. It also showcases the problematic history of control as a central force in the legitimization of a Western hegemony, and mainly that the contemporary problem or condition of governance after 9/11 has been on dangerous bodies or on others. In Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, Simone Brown makes it evident that there is an absence of theorization of this kind of racialized surveillance. Brown unpacks the laws, practices, and architectures of control that structured Black mobility, from slave passes to the introduction of the lantern laws in New York City in the 18th century. I mean, this is amazing. If you look at I think it's to your right there, the laws pictured here on this slide, it mandated that Black, mixed race, and Indigenous people must carry candle lanterns after dark and not be in company of a white person. Brown refers to the lantern as a prosthesis made mandatory after dark, a technology that made it possible for the Black body to be constantly illuminated from dusk to dawn, made knowable, locatable, and contained within the streets. So I think it's evident here that we can see not only the creation of a public order law based on race, but conditions in which Black bodies can be found guilty at any time, so subjected to these types of systems of control. Fast forward to the contemporary digital condition, we now see the colonized gaze develop into algorithmic biases in the age of automation. or what MIT Media Lab graduate Joe Buolamwini, in a nod to the literary and sociological term, the white gaze, has termed as the coded gaze. I'm just going to play a short video now. Hope you can hear it. Let me know if the sound's okay.
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask. I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera, or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child. Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
It's not just face classification, it's any data-centric technology.
Every day, we are all being scored.
Who gets hired? Who gets housing?
I am making predictions for your life right now.
The people who own the code deploy it on other people, and there is no accountability.
Management and Atlantic Towers wanted to install the facial recognition software. Pretty much turn this place into Fort Knox.
The technology is being rapidly adopted, and there are no safeguards.
We are socially controlled in a way that we don't see.
Technology that analyzes faces could be biased, but the company is pushing it anyway.
What demographic is it most effective on?
White men.
Show me that it's going to be fair, that it's legal, before you put it out. That's what we don't have yet.
It's going to take people coming together, striving for justice in this age of automation.
I forwarded this link, I think, to Francesca and Miguel, but I highly recommend for you, if you're interested, to watch it. The full documentary is on Netflix. Just as an extension of this coded gaze, or coded gaze, in an experiment that became viral on Twitter, Algorithm Watch showed that Google Vision Cloud, a computer vision service, labeled the image of a dark-skinned hand holding a thermometer as labeled as gun. And that same image with a salmon-colored overlay on the hand was enough for the computer to label it monocular. Google has since updated its algorithm. I think it was as of April 2020. So you can see here that it no longer returns a search of gun. Oh, what's happened here? It doesn't have the gun label anymore. However, this has not stopped the enormous lawsuits and amount of prejudice and biases against Google. There is a very long way to go. However, just like Joe Buolamwini, there is a growing group of spatial thinkers, artists, architects, who are thinking about a counter-surveillance practice. For instance, artist and geographer Trevor Paglin studies nautical charts, undersea maps to find internet cables, or scans the skies to uncover and make public the digital world's hidden landscapes and forbidden places. So again, a lot of his work is online, but I'm going to play a short clip so you kind of understand the methods that he deploys.
So Trevor, can you tell me what it is you're doing?
So tonight I want to photograph surveillance satellites.
a major artist whose work around state surveillance and governmental secrecy has never been more relevant.
Satellites weren't invented because we wanted to talk to each other around the world. Satellites were invented because we wanted to shoot nuclear weapons. I've always been suspicious of power. I started getting involved in punk rock, which was formative in terms of understanding the relationship between art and politics.
A child born today will grow up with no conception of privacy at all.
Mass surveillance as a phenomena came of age while I was working as an artist. After 9/11, when you get your film back, it's almost like this Where's Waldo kind of game where you pick out all the little drones that are in the image.
All of these places are really remote and hard to access. Why do you make a point of trying to find them?
It's my job.
We are merely a source of data. We are no longer human beings.
I think about the NSA, and then at some point you realize, oh, well, there's this way bigger thing than the NSA called Google and called Facebook. Images have always required a human in order to interpret them, and that has now changed.
Widow woman.
What happens if you take your glasses off?
Redneck? Yeah.
Why did you develop the software?
To show how classifying people is fucked up. Ways of seeing are never neutral. There's always forms of power inherent in those ways of seeing. For me, what is interesting about satellites is the knowledge that those infrastructures are looking at me.
Followed orbital reflector with great anticipation.
The primary mission is to put up the satellite, get ejected from the launch vehicle, deploy the balloon.
It has no military value, has no commercial value. And in that sense, it's the exact opposite of everything else that's ever been put into space.
He's driven by that sort of deep passion. That's what his brain works.
What I want out of art is to see the historical moment that we live in.
Again, this is a short trailer of Unseen Skies, which is a feature documentary directed by Yara Boo Melham, who's an Australian film director, and it came out last year. And again, very easy to find the full video, but super interesting when he does speak and lecture about this, that yeah, he says he draws and explores these nautical maps, the skies, and finds these choke points, he calls them, where there is this kind of convergence of multiple kind of digital infrastructures, whether that is on the seabed or in the sky. And his purpose in his work is basically to uncover what he claims is the digital world's hidden landscapes and forgotten places. And so some of the images, the photographs that he takes were in the video itself. But again, really kind of important work, I think, that's happening now around counter-surveying and counter-visuality. We can also look at architect Liam Young's Where the City Can't See, a narrative fiction film shot entirely with laser scanners in the Chinese-owned and controlled Detroit Economic Zone, the DEZ. The film follows a group of young factory workers who, in the words of Liam, are part of an underground community that work on the production lines by day and at night adorn themselves in machine vision camouflage and the tribal masks of anti-facial recognition to enact their escapist fantasies in the hidden spaces of the city. So as an extension to this line of thinking, I do want to return to my own pedagogical project, Cities Under Surveillance, a studio which is aware of the history of this visuality as a dominant tool for the command and control of space, people, and things, and has set out to turn the practices of visuality into a problem of analysis and architectural inquiry. The studio advocates for the tools of counter-visuality and the counter-surveyed body to transcend the codified language of traditional forms of architectural production and representation. A reimagining of the discipline's traditional forms of production and representation involves, as I introduced at the start of the lecture, a dismantling of the master's tools. In this case, a reconceptualization of what the practice of surveying and looking means today. Conceptually speaking, the practice of looking has to occupy the realm of confrontation, the intersection point of equivalency. It is to look directly at the privileged, the dominant narratives that have ruled a certain history, white masculinity and toxicity, enablers of colonial violence, and in turn claim political subjectivity and collectivity. The studio uses counter-visuality and the counter-survey as tools to challenge the boundaries of architectural education, both geographically and ideologically, by foregrounding systematically overlooked spaces, people, and things. In this case, we have an expanded drawing that is exposing the Australian Museum as a colonial entity who censors information through the processes of administration, class, and physical barriers, inhibiting access to traditional connection to culture and to country. If decolonial desires are to wreck, retool, and reassemble the colonizing university into decolonized contractions, the studio exercises counter-surveying by firstly acknowledging its own privilege, operating from an established institution in Sydney, Australia. As a space operating with a colonial within a colonial machine, the studio became a battlefield of sorts, as it centered social political tensions, conflicts, and conversations within an architecture school that sits within a broader university of technology. The project became self-reflective at times, asking what it means to be studying cities under surveillance and the spaces, people, and things belonging to these cities from an institution located on land that has its own deep colonial history. This requires a level of consciousness on the part of the studio and students to recognize, as Le Paperson eloquently describes in the introduction of the third university is possible, that this pedagogical exercise was driven by decolonial desires of decolonizing dreamers who are subversively part of the machinery and part machine themselves. The design studio transformed into a site for testing, exploring, and the translation of these decolonial desires, while simultaneously looking at itself in the mirror. The ones surveying were also being surveyed. This double mirror was reflected in a student project which deployed counter-surveying strategies to directly engage with the subversive nature of working on the transformation of a system from within a system. The studio space that we occupied, facing a main road in Sydney and 2 downs from an Australian public broadcaster, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, who at the time were being raided by the federal police, which many saw as an attack on press freedom, transformed into a space of confrontation. The project consisted of the design of a surveillance machine, pictured here, on the very border that divides the institution from the public. Parasitic-like intervention, half inside the studio space, half outside the footpath, half outside on the footpath, sorry, invited the corresponding audience to look into and look out onto its opposition. A series of cameras dispersed within the interior of the studio, as well as the entrance to the media broadcaster, and fed live and around-the-clock footage back onto screens viewed from within each side of the machine. So we're looking at the outside in here. Electronically linking yet inverting surveillance between the institution and the public, the installation rendered the spatial and material effects of voyeurism to an audience unconsciously drawn into an interrogation of vision and the very logics that construct archaic dichotomies of privateness and publicness in the first place. Exercising counter-visuality as an architectural tool also means to travel beyond the studio space and confront the sites under contestation, transforming them into what Bruno Latour refers to as matters of concern as opposed to matters of facts. The aim here is not to mimic colonial logics by visiting the sites and proposing a solution through traditional means of architecture, let's say a building. It is rather to bear witness to the effects of systems of control by being situated and immersed in the site and engaging with the people, their memories, and the material matter that constitute it, and to then synthesize and reframe the narrative to a wider audience. This was the main premise of Ways of Sightseeing, pictured here, a one-week workshop and exhibition which saw Cities Under Surveillance travel to Johannesburg in 2019 to collaborate with the Graduate School of Architecture's Unit 14 Rogue Economies, led by Thuresh Govender and Sarah de Villiers at the University of Johannesburg. The student projects culminating from the workshop were on display in Johannesburg's student and cultural Braamfontein precincts in one of the GSA's teaching spaces, the GSA Metro, offering a highly visible street frontage, allowing an opportunity for architecture to publicly be engaged with with a kind of a broader audience, was seen at the launch of the event here. Drawing on both cities, that is Sydney and Johannesburg's preoccupation with security and surveillance, the collaborative project paired students from both universities. So GSA students presented sites of risk in Johannesburg, and UTS offered instruments to read the form of control implicit in these sites. So one was learning from the other, and in a way, the tools that were embedded by the students of Cities Under Surveillance, let's say in this case, you're seeing here kind of forensic methods, the gathering and collecting of archival material to redraw narratives of a particular site in Johannesburg, was the basic kind of core and premise of the exercise, and actually worked really well. Also expanding the confines of its institutional boundaries, another student project entitled Occupying the Outline, completed in 2019, designed a one-to-one moving installation and performance that occupied a contested site in Sydney. Using legislation and policy as a tool to read forms of inclusion and exclusion, the project critically mapped the gradual privatisation and gentrification of Sydney and identified a grey border that sits in between and outside 2 zones of regulation, so almost like a legal loophole. The 3-point line on the map of this kind of grey border translates to a 6-metre wide zone in reality, creating a thickened border condition which became the site of occupation through the one-to-one moving installation. A trail of white chalk physically marked the extent of the procession along this 6-metre wide border, rendering the spatial implication of legislation and text visible to the public. The performance was an act to reclaim the grey zone of the city through the body and invite a public audience to enter into a performative relationship with the invisible border that sits outside the legislation. The public performance brings the matter of concern to the eyes and ears of those who have assembled around it, as Latour again states, challenging us to reconsider the agency of legislation and policy in shaping our cities. So I'm just going to play a short clip now to illustrate the kind of moving installation. I love this image, by the way. The police were right behind the students as they were wheeling around this machine in the city.
The thickened border that lies between 2 territories defined by the Liquor Amendment Act 2008. The outline separates 2 lockout zones, the CBD Entertainment Precinct and the King's Cross Precinct. The border is a zone that lies outside of the regulations of both precincts, defined as a 3-point line on the map that translates to a 6-metre wide zone in reality, as well as the written description of the roads along which it runs. Therefore, this border is not a line, but a territory, an outline waiting to be occupied. We use this outline to propose a new writing of the city. We bring the outline to life through physically drawing the boundary where the lockout law applies, exposing to the greater public the implications of legislation. We propose a new act, the Occupation of the Border Act 2019, that reclaims, rewrites, and remeasures the grey zones of the city. Utilising the complexities and contradictions of the existing legislation to cite and construct our proposal. We reclaim the city through the collector, rewrite through the use of grey words, and finally remeasure through the drawing of the outline. The grey words, or, any, may, and if, each used as a tool of manipulation within legislation, are stamped in black as a critique of the implications upon the city. The collector gathers and archives data from the street surface of the zone. The archive combines these mechanisms as evidence and influence of the physical writing of the city. The outline is drawn in chalk after the collection has been gathered and stamped. This leaves behind a trace of our path and the zones that we occupied. Finally, the city has been reread through our conversations around the rotating stage. We use the machine as a platform to project our own agendas in combat with the enforced agendas of the City of Sydney.
So both of the students actually continued to do thesis projects, and I want to present one of them here by Dana Majan, which is an extension of this preliminary work that she worked on with Freya Alston. The thesis project, Or, Any, If, May, A Text of Two Cities, is a screenplay weaving architecture with performance and politics to challenge and reconstruct a narrative that explores the role of text legislation in 2 contemporary cities, Sydney and Johannesburg. As Jennifer Bloomer states, a text is a woven thing, and similar to Bloomer's writing, the short film weaves in and out of contexts, spaces, words, languages, and scenes to make associations and construct counter-narratives of the city. The film is 20 minutes long. I'm not playing the whole thing. We don't have time for that, but I'm going to play 2 short sections here to give you an understanding. Oh. Oh, sorry, I don't know why that's happening.
Texture, text array, to weave, join, fit together, bray, interweave, construct, fabricate, build. Text, a noun, originating from the Latin verb texere. Text is a woven thing, a fabricated thing, a built thing. People, bodies, space, all regulated through text. Text constructed for all, text fabricated by a select few. Text woven, behind al-bab we cannot open, in a maktab we cannot enter, from al-kursi we cannot access. Text written in tongues we do not understand. Text, word, definition, section, subsection, reference, amendments, acts. To act is to take action. To act is to set motion. To act is to perform, to play a part, a role. The art of performing
to contradiction.
Me. Swo tsariwa hi ririmi leri hi nga ri twisiseki. The border thickens, excluding a select many. A tongue which excludes they, him, her value, her body, her choices, forcing her choices to only take place behind a closed door, unregulated, exchanging self and being exchanged, unregulated in a way that blurs the line between exploitation and expression. In 2007, further exclusions are made. The action of sex work is criminalized. The new text woven the city fabric even tighter. The actions are excluded from the quilt of the city.
The director calls her name to the stage. All eyes on her, surrounded by al-kursi. She counts her steps to the beat. She loses count. She scans the stage for a prop to guide her.
The Bill of Rights, Section 22, freedom of trade, occupation, and profession. Every citizen has the right to choose their trade, occupation, or profession freely. The practice of a trade, occupation, or profession may be regulated by law.
Freely regulated. Criminalized in 2007.
It's a really fantastic film. I might actually pass this one on to you, Francesca and Miguel, again to share with the students, considering it is about 20 minutes long, the whole thing. But really interesting, again, as an exploration of this idea of weaving, rewriting the city, obviously looking at sex work here and the criminalization of the body through gender. So if a right to look is a claim to a right to the real and it's reshaping, the ability to look, confront, and therefore access the real was recently challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in lieu of the pandemic putting a field trip to Beirut in 2020 on hold for us, the studio navigated what it means to operate from a distance. A dialogue was set up with the city through a week-long lecture series titled Beirut from a Distance, and they're all the lectures are actually online on the city's under surveillance website. We invited architects, artists, and writers who have or are working in Beirut. The shift to a simulated consumption of space via the screen during this time foregrounded the need to deploy forensic methodologies when working from a distance. The studio turned to studying the counter-visual strategies deployed by spatial practices such as the Atlas Group, who are pictured here, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Cooking Section, Nolan Oswald Dennis, to name a few, who all reconstruct alternative narratives in post-colonial and post-traumatic contexts, and at times from a distance themselves. Operating as detectives, the collection of evidence from a range of media, including social media, to formal archival documents, became critical in assembling distanced and fragmented documents to construct these alternative architectural narratives. For instance, the X collection collected images that have circulated in the media of the interior of Beirut, a building that has undergone several transformations, including a space for snipers during the Lebanese civil war. The analysis of these images identified material objects and remnants from the interior, including the stair, the wall, the sandbag, the arc, and the tile. Objects that became the protagonists in constructing alternative narratives for this particular student. The image inventory of the objects were rescaled, skewed, and reconfigured to construct chimeras, composite architectures that emerged through the script. Using the medium of video narrative, stories of these objects emerged on the screen through an interplay between a script, drawing, and collage. This mixed media and spatiotemporal construction subverts traditional conventions of architectural representation by transforming their instructive role, as seen predominantly in construction drawings, let's say, to one of storytelling. So again, a lot of the work is time-based video, kind of mixed media. So I'm sharing this project too, and I'm only going to play the first 2 minutes where I think they investigated the front screen and built up this chimera.
The front stairs. We flank the atrium as you enter from the street on the corner of Damascus and Independence Street. Search for figure S01. We are a vertical axis between private domains. Duplicate, reflect, and copy 4 times. A well-rehearsed tempo of surfaces, with landings at the 14th step, halfway and on every level, each a refrain and a pause. On every landing, there are 2 openings, where unimpeded views of Sudeco Square are framed through the open colonnade. Messages are passed down our treads. Access to us is by invitation only. We trace the footsteps as they bound up and stumble back down. We converse with the gowns and the feathers as they graze our banisters on their way to the regular evening soirees on the upper floors. Our tempered order has been disturbed, and we now lie in disarray. Some of us were sold by the kilogram. Our value holds through time. The softness of our material has been exposed. The rehearsal is suspended, and we are ready to learn a new harmony.
The back stair.
So it continues through all of the elements that they were archiving and reconfiguring at the same time. The last project I want to show, where I guess a similar approach was taken, the project plot 987, Surfaced Phantom of the Egg, examined how the Egg, an unfinished and abandoned cinema in Beirut, since the Civil War, has become a host for the city's complex social and cultural histories through its various occupations, both tangible and intangible. It became a space of protest, really the public space of the city itself, in its kind of abandoned state. Tracing these occupations from the Civil War to the 2019 revolution, the intervention, which is this drawing, resurfaces the phantom states of the building, the egg, through the reconstruction of archival fragments, documents, narrative, and perceptions. The laid cultural and socio-political role of the egg in the city is somewhat reclaimed through the drawing, which represents a constellation between bodies, materials, space, and documents that form its surface. An entanglement of the things that have been there and the things that might become. So I hope that through this very short talk, and in particular the studio work, that overlooked histories are waiting to be unravelled and alternative futures to be told through the counter-visual and the counter-surveyed body. For a visually literate generation who have lived in a world of screens saturated with images, this should not be hard. You need to first and foremost claim the right to look before embarking on any decolonial desires. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Thank you.
I don't think she couldn't hear the applause.
Oh. Thank you.
Endriana, thank you so much. Fantastic lecture, and thank you for kind of so generously sharing your practice, your teaching practice, the work of students and so on. You know, this doesn't often happen in lectures, and it's often, in a sense, the most useful kind of insights in an education context, in a workshop context. Are you happy to take questions?
Sure, yes. It's almost 10 p.m. here, but I can, yeah, I'll stay up.
Okay, just the questions, because then we have our
sure.
So I don't know if anybody's got.
Sure. Thank you, Endriana, for showing us your work and your students' work. Here, with regards to an early quote about the masters, you cannot deconstruct the master's tools or the master's house using the master's tools, right? In your own personal research and in your teaching and the work of your students, what is your own process of self-diagnostic to make sure, you know, at certain points along the way of your process, you make sure, oh, is what I'm doing, are we co-opting the master's tools? How do you check yourself to make sure that doesn't happen?
It's a very good question. I think it is a question that comes down to representation, as I've kind of echoed and continued to highlight in the lecture itself. To dismantle a master's tool requires obviously to first of all kind of define what the tool is that you're using to dismantle that kind of colonial gaze, and by tool, I guess something that I've been discussing recently with a few colleagues and my peers is, you know, to question what that toolkit is today for an architect. And I often say to my students, is a construction drawing, although some of my peers would claim that that is the kind of the document that we should be using to discuss all these kind of complex geopolitical urgencies. I always ask the students, are you representing in a way that actually starts to reflect or communicate the complexities of these histories or these futures? So is a plan the best way? In the case of the studio, I think it's been emphasized that we are using some of these kind of time-based mediums, and it probably reflects my PhD work where I'm really looking at kind of discourse on the screen, the kind of multi-layered nature, the kind of hybrid mediums that were being explored and tested through the work of, let's say, Dilys Scofidio, Renfro, and also I guess that's a longer lineage to the 60s and 70s video work and installation work, where, you know, they were talking about feedback loops and all of these kind of circuits, but also kind of what happens when you start to challenge these kind of unitary ways of thinking and operating. So for me, it's always been about the multiple, the multi-layered, the spatio-temporal, to kind of break these the linearity, I guess, that's embedded in so much of our kind of traditional education, architectural education. So I kind of hope that makes sense. I'm always constantly reminding, you know, is this the best document? Is this the best form of representation to be using and expressing these kind of complex histories?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
A comment rather than a question. I had no idea that discipline and punish was in the original surveiller in Commodification. You know? So the surveillance was cut out of the translation of the title. You know,
yeah.
It's an extraordinary thing. And it completely changes the sense. Surveillance, the exposure of surveillance was almost censored in the translation.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to unpack in just that slide.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes. How did Fico ever agree to that translation of his title? I can't imagine. Yeah.
I have no idea, but I think it's something that Brown kind of looks at, the different terminologies and associations with surveillance, surveillance. I mean, there's so many kind of the kind of epistemological strains or trajectories of these terms and the different outcomes of each one of them. So yeah, I don't know what you know, the missing kind of, or the mistranslation, or the complete erasure of surveillance there. I don't know how we would have took that on, but
okay, well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Endriana for.
Thank you, Francesca, Miguel, to all the students. Good luck. I know today you're celebrating, it's the first week, end of the first week. So good luck with everything.
We're getting that. Okay, we'll send you the link for the crib later. Bye.
Thank you. Good night. See ya.